What's up guys? Today we're going to be making a 4-foot long rustic style shoe rack bench with no screws. We'll just be using some basic table saw joinery and glue. I always start by designing the model in SketchUp. Or do I? This is the first build where I'm actually trying to copy another design I was shown by the customer. It's simple enough, definitely doable, and I was told I could add my own twist to it. With an idea of what we're going to build, now we go over to SketchUp. The only dimensions I was given was 48 inches long. I went with the standard 18 inches high and a 14-inch width. When I design, I always start by making a rectangle of the rough dimensions, and then I subtract the volume from there. The only difference between mine and the picture that I was given is that I decided against the breadboard ends. It's a pretty low resolution picture, but from what I can see, the breadboard ends are attached right at the post. So if not secured properly, or with wear and tear over time, it could eventually snap at the connecting seam. I figured the best thing to do would be to have one board running the full 48-inch length. The top is made from one 8-foot 2x10. It's cut in half, and then both 4-foot sections are run through the table saw, making them 7 inches wide. Then they get glued together. The legs are 2x4s glued together, making homemade 4x4s. Then they're planed down to a true 3x3, then cut to their final length at the table saw. I first squared up one end at the table saw, then I clamped all 4 pieces together and ran the opposite end through the saw, giving me 4 legs at a final length of 16.5 inches. The stretchers are a 2x4 cut down to 12 inches, then ripped down to a 3-inch width at the table saw. Lastly, the shelf is a 1x12, 8-foot long rough pine board. I originally wanted to purchase an already finished 4-foot 1x10, but the Home Depot near me only had a few left on the shelf and they were in very poor condition. After reviewing my options, I figured the best course of action was to get some rough lumber and plane it down myself. So this was first cut to its final length of 37 inches, then ripped down to 11 inches, then planed down to 3/4 inches. Once the glue had dried on the top, I used a hand plane to get it smooth and take down any high spots. Then I used a circular saw and a speed square to cut both ends flush. I took off all the sharp corners using a 1/4-inch roundover bit, and I sanded everything with 80 grit and 120 grit sandpaper, including hand sanding the round edges. Cutting the legs was the only difficult part of this build. It took a lot of thought to try and copy the picture, yet come up with something that was simple and sturdy. I have used screws and covered them up with dowels in the past, but I find it hard to line everything up when you're drilling through 3 inches of material just to fashion a shelf and a leg together. Using dowels and wood glue would have been awesome, but the whole shelf would have had to be assembled at once, and dowels would definitely not be as strong as cutting dados. So dados is what I went for. I figured I would cut the dado with my table saw. I don't have a dado stack, but I did just put in a fresh blade at the beginning of this build. So taking it very slow, I made my first cut and then moved the fence 1/8 of an inch at a time. I made all 4 cuts on each leg at the same time. This way, if I made a slight mistake in measurement, I would make that slight mistake on all 4 legs, and you wouldn't be able to really see it in the final product. Once I finished up, I ran into a bit of a problem. I had accidentally cut one too many passes, basically making the dado about 1/8 of an inch too wide. Some people might not think this is a big deal, but when everything needs to be perfect for a friction fit, it was a pretty big deal. Luckily, I had some 2x6 cutoffs from last week's bed build. I took about 1 inch off one side, making sure I got rid of the pesky round edge, then took off 1 inch on the other side. I measured the dado I had already cut, and then I set the table saw fence to about 1/8 of an inch larger than that. Made my first cut, then checked the fit. Then I would readjust the fence about 1/32 of an inch and run the board through again, sneaking up on the final size. I did this about 4 times before I finally got a width that was pretty friction fit. Then I ran the second board through the table saw as well. Finally, I set the fence to 12 inches and then cut it to what I thought would have been the final length. Foreshadowing maybe? With the stretchers and legs done, the bench was looking like a bench, which is good. Now came hours of pondering how to attach the shelf. Originally, I had designed the shelf to be 9¼ inches wide, since that's the width of a 1x10. However, since I was forced to get a 1x12 and plane it down myself, I had an 11½ inch wide shelf. I wanted to keep the shelf as wide as possible. If I was to keep it at 11 or more inches, the dados would have to be 2½ inches wide on the leg, giving the legs only ½ an inch or less of wood left to support themselves. Next I thought about 1½ inch dado, which would make the shelf 9 inches wide. With 9¼ inches being too small but 11 being too wide, I settled upon 10 inches in width, which involved me cutting a 2-inch dado into the leg. I cut the dado the same way. The saw blade was set to 2 inches in height, and I moved the fence over 1/8 inch at a time. I wised up and bought a shop vac to handle the dust. This was 100% worth it. The dado cut went by much faster than the last one. Once I was happy with the cuts, I dry fit it in the garage to see what it would look like. It always feels good when things fit together perfectly and you don't need to use screws to hold everything in place. The joinery almost worked out. The stretchers ended up sticking out about 1/8 inch on one side. At first I thought I could let this go and claim it was part of the rustic design, but after a close inspection I decided that wasn't really an option. Why would I spend so much time making these joints so perfect only to leave this small imperfection? So over at the workbench, I flushed up one side of the stretcher with the leg and then made a mark on the other side. I snuck up on that line with the miter saw. Thankfully, I was able to cut both stringers to a perfect size and didn't need to cut a third set. My camera died and it was late at night, so instead of waiting for it to charge, I just applied the stain and went to bed. I find finishing work on a project with tight corners hard to do when fully assembled. Specifically wipe on wipe off stain, or shelves that are close together so you don't have much room to work with. So I decided it would be best to finish them before assembly. Once the stain was dry, every part got 2 coats of min-wax polyacrylic with a light 320 grit sand in between coats. The top got an extra 3 coats of Verithane's triple thick polyurethane. This stuff is the best when it comes to wet sanding and polishing to an extremely durable yet smooth finish. I sanded with 320 grit in between coats, a little bit harder than I sanded with the min-wax polyacrylic, because I wanted to wear down the brush marks. They tend to build up and can be highly visible after a few coats. The assembly happened in 3 parts: stretchers, shelf, top. I figured the smart thing to do was to clamp the legs together. And this can be the right thing to do if you wait for the polyacrylic to fully cure, which I did not. Good thing I only let the glue dry for about 2 hours, otherwise the legs would have cured together. I ended up having to do some light sanding with 600 grit paper and then applying the polyacrylic as needed. After that I applied some glue to the shelf dados and inserted the shelf. I then clamped it up and did a few more touch-ups with the polyacrylic. To polish the bench top, I wet sanded starting with 600 grit and working my way up to 2000 grit. Then I used a 2-part car polish compound and finished off with turtle wax. I talked with the client, and we decided that since this would be in a high traffic area of the house and used daily, it would be best to have the most amount of protection on the top. Lastly, I had to attach the top. Dowels were totally the way to go. I came this far without screws. There's no way I was going back now. I used my dowel jig to drill holes in the center of the leg. Then I put some metal spikes in. I flipped the bench upside down, and once I had the legs perfectly centered, I added a bit of downward pressure, and those spikes created indents in the wood, giving me the exact spot to drill for the other part of the dowel. I used my doweling jig to make sure I was drilling a perfect 90-degree angle into the board. Then bam, Bob's your uncle. With all the legs done, I added some wood glue and clamped it all down. Once the glue dried, I took it inside and added some felt protectors on the bottom. This bench was going out a front entrance, so having something to keep it from damaging the floor was important. And with that, it was finally done. At first I was unsure how I felt about this bench. It's not your normal design, but I did really enjoy building it. This is the first project I've cut Dados for joinery, and I think it turned out really, really well. Everything fit together like a glove. The client loved it, and hopefully he'll be back in the future for more furniture. If you liked what you saw, feel free to subscribe. And if you learned something, how about a thumbs up? I'm trying to grow this channel so more people can learn along with me. Thanks for watching.